Hello, everyone. Professor Cynic here. A week or so after the conclusion of Game of Thrones, I had my mouse cursor hovering over the cancel button for my HBO Now subscription. And then I heard about the miniseries Chernobyl. What immediately caught my eye was Jared Harris's appearance in the commercial. I absolutely adored his performance in Mad Men playing the part of Lane Price, and the Chernobyl disaster is always something fascinating. It always has been something that's fascinating to me. But life happens, and I never had the chance to study it any further than, the information I was given in high school history class. So I stayed the execution of my HBO Now account and decided to give the series a shot. What followed was a radioactive emitting binge session over the course of one night. I stayed up until 2 in the morning watching the first 4 episodes of Chernobyl. I immediately went to the local college and found myself a dosimeter to make sure I wasn't being exposed to undue levels of Rotkins, and I don't really even know what those are in the first place. Other than it'll melt your skin off if you're around them. I had to wait a couple more days before the release of the finale, and I wanted to have a general discussion about this series now that it's complete. So here's the plan. I'm going to do a quick summary of the series and then move into the discussion. Now, I want to make this clear. This video is intended to be viewed if you've already seen the series. If you have no intentions of watching it or don't care about the spoilers, then you're good to go. Chernobyl opens with our protagonist, Valery Legazov, sitting in a dark Soviet apartment with his cat, creating some audio tapes that provide some details about the happenings at Chernobyl. At this point, the disaster has already occurred. The writers here, they decided to start the series with the ending. Valery concludes his tape and walks them outside under the guise of taking out the trash. In the distance, Valery sees a car with a man in it, clearly keeping an eye on him. He turns the corner down the alley, stashes the tapes in a vent, and proceeds back to the apartment. It's here that we are slowly teased to how the night will tragically end for Valery. He puts out several dishes for his cat and fills them with food, far more than needed for a single meal. But where is he going? Valery then proceeds to hang a noose from the ceiling, step on a chair, and take his own life. A quick spoiler here for Mad Men. I noticed an odd parallel between the series in that in Mad Men, Jared Harris's character ends the series with his death by hanging, and in Chernobyl, the series begins with his death by hanging. Just an interesting little thing that I noticed. But anyway, from here we are whisked back to the disaster at Chernobyl. The time period they chose to introduce us to the event is intriguing because it isn't with the events leading up to the reactor meltdown. No. We are shot straight to the aftermath. We see a bunch of power plant workers nervously sitting in the control room. Clearly, something is the matter. It's here that we see the situation continue to descend into madness. Anatoly Dyatlov, the assistant chief engineer for the power plant, is barking orders to the much younger and nervous workers. They were performing a safety test, and clearly something went wrong. He starts receiving reports from workers who are closer to the scene that something terrible has happened, perhaps even the unthinkable. The reactor may have exploded. Of course, this would be catastrophic, but Dyatlov wants nothing to hear of it. He refuses to believe something so horrendous occurred under his watch. At this point, he keeps feeding young men into the meat grinder, sending them down to the site of the accident to try and rectify the situation, only to continuously see them return with radiation burns. But he persists. To him, nothing is the matter. The situation is completely under control. The fire department is called, given a report that there is a fire at the Chernobyl power plant. No biggie, right? Just a simple fire on the roof. Firefighters are dispatched to deal with the fire. As they arrive at the scene, they see that a part of the building is blown out. Smooth black rocks are scattered everywhere, which we later find out is graphite from inside the reactor core. Highly radioactive at this point, by the way. But the firefighters don't know this and heroically try to put out the fire. But soon they start dropping like flies. They're being pelted by atomic-sized bullets of radioactivity. Some of them start vomiting from the exposure. Some already have visible radiation burns. A council is called in the middle of the night that consists of management from the power plant to assess the situation. Again, everyone is assured that everything is under control, just a simple fire, but we already know things aren't okay. One of the workers reports to the group that he saw graphite scattered about the building, but that is impossible. That would mean the reactor blew, and that is just beyond belief. And as it seems, in a properly functioning reactor, it would be nearly impossible. The worker is then ordered to go to the roof to check out the scene. He knows this is a death sentence. If he looks over that edge, he will be blasted with an onslaught of radiation. But this is Soviet Union that we're talking about here. He doesn't have much of a choice. The worker makes the long walk up the steps and wearily peeks over the edge to confirm what we already know. The situation is beyond amenable. The reactor is nothing but bits scattered about the earth. As he turns, we see his face already red with radiation burns. The state creates a commission to deal with the Chernobyl situation, but at this point, nearly everyone is still under the belief that the situation is under control. Valery is brought into the fray as an expert on the commission. His only purpose is to answer questions about reactors if needed, nothing more. The commission meets and they agree that the situation is under control, but not Valery. As the meeting is about to adjourn, he slams his hand to the table. He knows something is awry. The commission reluctantly allows him to speak. He finds it curious that in the report, smooth black mineral was found at the site. Valery also believes this to be graphite, which, if true, means the situation is much more dire than the commission is treating it. They doubt Valery, but he persists. Eventually, they tell him, fine, you go check it then, and take this guy with you. That guy is Boris Sherbina, the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, which is just communist talk for a big cheese in the Soviet government. Boris is none too happy about having to gallivant with Valery, but gallivant he does, and the duo rides a chopper to Pripyat, where Valery's worst nightmare is confirmed. The reactor is blown. Despite the Soviet Union's attempts to hide the disaster, the whispers begin to turn to shouts. Ulana Homyuk, a nuclear physicist, detects high levels of radiation all the way in Minsk, which is about 450 kilometers away. Soon, the rest of the world knows. The United States takes satellite photos of the Chernobyl plant and realizes something went horribly wrong. The cat is out of the bag. Ulana eventually travels to Pripyat to meet with Valery. She sets out on a mission to discover exactly what happened at Chernobyl on that fateful April night in 1986. Meanwhile, Valery works with Boris on damage control. Boron and sand are dropped on the reactor site, which apparently creates lava. So a tunnel is dug by a bunch of naked miners to prevent the radioactive lava from poisoning the water. Some lunar rovers attempt to clear the roof of graphite, which fails miserably, and biorobots are requisitioned to the task, i.e. humans in suits, in 90-second intervals to reduce radiation exposure. Eventually, things calm down, but there's still the question of who done it, or perhaps how done it. After interviewing survivors, Ulana discovers that there was gross incompetence by some of the staff, but she still can't figure out how this happened. Despite the cataclysmic screw-up, this shouldn't have physically been possible. Herein lies a dark secret that Valery is aware of. Long story short, the tips of the boron control rods were covered in graphite to save costs. Control rods are there to slow the reaction down, but here's the thing. Graphite actually serves to temporarily increase the activity in the reactor, and with the perfect storm brewing during the testing scenario, the tips touched first, increased the reaction, and blew the plant to smithereens. Many other plants in the Soviet Union have reactors with these questionable control rods with the graphite tips, but the Soviets are a proud nation. They can't fathom admitting that the design of the reactor contributed to Pripyat's demise. Valery goes before a gathering of atomic experts from around the world in Vienna. He has a chance to tell the world that there is a faulty design in the reactors. Perhaps forcing the Soviet Union to change the design, but he instead chooses to say it was entirely user error. But he has one more chance. At the trial for the administration of the Chernobyl plant, it's here that he decides to tell the truth to the world. Well, at least the Soviets in the room. His testimony is immediately discarded, and he is banished from contributing to the atomic community or discussing Chernobyl indefinitely. And so the ending brings us to the beginning. The KGB drives Valery off, and in the years that follow, Valery takes his life. But he leaves his secrets behind about Chernobyl on those tapes. These circulate, and the world listens. So that's Chernobyl in a nutshell. I left out plenty of details for the sake of brevity, but I hope that gives you a glimpse at the happenings in the series. And so where do we go from here? It's difficult in the best way possible because Chernobyl absolutely floored me with how good it was. I haven't been gripped by a series like this in quite some time. So I'm just going to make some random points about the series here and roll with it. First, let's talk about the story structure. It was simple, but masterfully executed. It would have been very easy for the writers and directors to take a straight linear approach. Start from the events leading up to the disaster, move to the cleanup investigation, and Valery's unfortunate conclusion. But, they could have done this, and the series would have probably still been great. But beginning the series with Valery's death and then rewinding served to hook me from the very first scene. I now had investment in this character who I knew nothing about and really don't see again until quite some time later in the episode. But structurally, what made the storytelling even better than that decision was how the actual disaster unfolded. They could have started with Valery's death and then gone to the events leading up to the disaster, but instead, they throw you into the heart of the disaster, giving you no context of what happened, to only show their pair of aces at the very end of the series. That last episode could have been a complete bore, with the majority of the episode being the trial, but during the trial we're whisked away to the events that lead up to the disaster. It was a really satisfying payoff. I give credit to the writing and directing here. There wasn't a moment in the series that I felt like I was slogging through. The beginning had me, the middle pulled me even deeper, and the finale brought me to a satisfying completion. Sorry for the unpleasant analogy. Chernobyl is a masterclass in quality storytelling. Going to pivot a little bit here to another storytelling element that was a bit strange to me at first, but I quickly got over it. So as you know, Chernobyl occurs in the USSR. The actors don't speak in Russian, or maybe it would have been Ukrainian. Sorry, my ignorance is showing here, but they speak English for the benefit of the audience and the actors. It was just a little weird for me to wrap my mind around because we have actors posing as Soviets speaking English with mostly English accents. I questioned the choice originally during the first episode. I thought to myself, I would have much rather had actors from the region speak in their native tongue with subtitles because it just didn't feel authentic. And after I had a bit of time to settle in, I disregarded this opinion. First and foremost, the performance of these actors and actresses was superb. I quickly forgot that. And two, it was just sort of an unveiling of my personal biases, because this happens in movies all the time. Where a story is taking place in a location where English isn't the primary language, yet they're speaking it anyway. Ultimately, I think they made the right choice here, but at the beginning of the series, it just kind of felt a little bit weird. But ultimately, it ended up being okay. Pivoting now to the cast. First, let's take a look at our primary protagonist, Valery Logasov, by way of Jared Harris. It was nothing short of a stellar performance. What Harris did really well was project the feelings of a conflicted man who wants to do the right thing, but knows that there's a system backed by an entire nation that doesn't care about doing the right thing. It cares about saving face. You see his struggle from the very beginning. From the moment he joins the commission and making the daring move to slam his fists on the table in order to say what needs to be said, you can see in Harris's face at that moment As his hand hits the table, that he realizes how dangerous this move was. But he went ahead anyway, and this is a preview of what Valeri will have to face throughout the series. He's an intelligent man with a mind governed by reason, drowning in a sea of individuals that would rather believe a beautiful lie than an uncomfortable truth. But he also shows the human side of Legazov. He isn't above preserving himself at the cost of the greater good. He has opportunities along the way to whistleblow, but he knows that the result is certain death. Of course, in the end, he comes through with his testimony to let at least the Soviet Union know that there's a flaw with the reactor design, and eventually the rest of the world with his tapes. But the Chernobyl series gave us a lead protagonist who did his best to fight the system, but at his core is human, just like the rest of us, not immune to the fears and tendencies ingrained in our DNA. And Jared Harris brought this to us, so bravo on his performance. Next, let's talk about Ulana Homyuk, played by Emily Watson. She was the nuclear physicist who paired with Legazov to tackle the problem at Chernobyl. She eventually splits off on her own to interview those involved in the incident and study the build of the reactor to get to the bottom of what happened that night. Per the credits at the end of Chernobyl, Homyuk was a character created for the miniseries. She was there to represent the collective of those in the sciences that assisted in the disaster. And to this end, her performance was well executed. Frequently, she is that little angel on Legazov's shoulder, egging him on to do the right thing. The major example is her insistence that Legazov tell everyone about the design flaw during the meeting at Vienna, which fails to come to fruition there, but she succeeds in convincing him to do so at the trial anyway. One exchange between the two really stuck out to me. Homyuk goes to Legazov's apartment to plead with him one more time to tell the truth during the trial. At this point, we're led to believe that Legazov is suffering mightily from radiation exposure he incurred at Pripyat. We don't know how much time he has, but the outlook feels grim. I'm not quoting directly here, but Legazov says something to the effect of, "I did what I had to do, and it cost me my life. Isn't that enough?" Homyuk replies, "No, it isn't." As the words come out fresh like a whip on Legazov, they seem cold and heartless. After all, Legazov has essentially sacrificed himself to be at the Chernobyl site and assist with the recovery. Wasn't that enough? It takes a while, though, to realize what is at the heart of Homyuk's statement. She isn't saying that Legazov sacrificed nothing. Anyone can see that. But she knows that one man and one man alone has the power and, more importantly, the information to generate substantial change. And that man is Legazov. Legazov proceeds to suggest that Homyuk could present the information because, she also has it. But she relents. The cold hard truth is there is little chance that people will take her seriously because while she is a brilliant and gifted scientist, she is also a woman in a time where female scientists aren't greatly respected. She wasn't the figurehead hero at Chernobyl. The deck is stacked against her, and Legazov holds the pair of aces in his hands. Is it fair? No. But Homyuk realizes that this is the reality of the time and place they live in. Homyuk was meant to be a character who encompasses not only a group of people, but an ideal, the good that remains in humanity, and Emily Watson was excellent in this endeavor. And then we have Boris Sherbina, played by Stellan Skarsgård. To be clear, Boris was a real person, but while Homyuk was a character who represented the good in humanity, Sherbina is arguably a character who represents all that is bad about the rigid political system. Boris and Valeri are thrown together in the classic trope of unwilling partners, but as they spend more time together, the two become, they come to a mutual understanding. Boris will be the go-getter. He has the necessary connections in the Soviet political system to get whatever is needed at a moment's notice. And Valeri will be the planner. Combined, they spearhead the efforts to settle the shaky situation in Pripyat. Initially, it's easy to see Boris as the villain, at least in those first couple of episodes, but he comes to the same conclusion as Valeri and Ulana, that the reactors need fixing. But here is where the contrast between Boris and Ulana is more intriguing than that of Boris and Valeri, despite them being the token buddy pairing. because they both want the same result, safe reactors. But how do we get from point A to B? That depends on the character. We know that Homyuk thinks that Valeri should spill the beans. This is perhaps the more noble and daring option, but Boris has a more pragmatic suggestion. Don't tell the public and make a deal with the KGB. Get assurances from them that the graphite-tipped control rods will be replaced and the information will stay as it is today, hidden from the public eye. Of course, we know the path that is taken, and in the end, it seems that this is the only thing that spurred change. And as we find out, Valeri actually had received assurances that the reactors with similar design would be reviewed, but nothing had been done at the time of the trial. There was one scene in particular that Skarsgård shined in. During a recess for the trial, Boris and Valeri share a seat outside. Boris shows Valeri a bloody handkerchief that he had been coughing into, expressing that he's not long for this world. Boris ruminates on his mortality, that he thought he would be a man of importance, and instead, this is what he became, with no sand left in the hourglass to do much else of consequence. He also discusses the fact that he was likely put in charge of the Chernobyl Commission because at the time they thought it wasn't a big deal, and they could trust something that wasn't a big deal with Boris, a man of, in his eyes, very little importance. Valeri makes a retort that is something to the effect of, they made the mistake of picking the one honest, good man from a pool of lifetime political men who couldn't think for themselves. He continues to stress Boris's importance. After all, if Valeri needed something, anything, he had it in an instant. And that was thanks to Boris and his deep knowledge of the politics in the Soviet Union. The protagonist trio of Harris, Watson, and Skarsgård was a powerhouse, and they should be commended for their performance in Chernobyl. There's one last character I want to mention before moving on. Anatoly Dyatlov, played by Paul Ritter. The man who arguably was the biggest straw in the pile that broke the camel's back, at least from a human error aspect. He was such a good villain. I think that sometimes people don't understand how integral a well-rounded villain is for a good story. Admittedly, we don't see him much in the middle parts of the series, but he's at the forefront in the ending and makes his presence known. His portrayal of Dyatlov was such that you love to hate him, and that is a good villain in my book. So I just wanted to make a quick nod to him and his performance. I wanted to wrap this up with some thoughts that were swirling in my head after watching the series as they pertained to the real events that occurred in Chernobyl. Now, of course, I only have the information provided to me in the miniseries, so I'll try and stay away from the micro interactions between characters and focus more on the macro general attitudes of the characters and events. One of the points that amazed me is just how pervasive a style of thinking can be. What I'm referring to is the groupthink that was present in the Soviet Union. Throughout the entire series, the theme at the forefront through all of it was a denial of what lies right before you. And sitting here in my basement laboratory in Wisconsin in the year 2019, it's easy for me to say, you fools, clearly something is wrong. You needed to react 100 times faster than you did at Chernobyl. And that's true. It did need a swifter response, but that's just it, isn't it? I don't think it's that they didn't necessarily know how insurmountable the situation was. It's that they didn't want to face the insurmountability. Mind you, these were, if I recall correctly, reactors that were designed within the Soviet Union. So admission of the fact that something that we designed caused a global problem, is it far-fetched to think that our ideals, our system, our way of life caused this? And I think there you have the heart of the problem. This form of life, while at times manifested itself to the public eye as a well-oiled machine, had its problems. You fear your curiosities. You don't question authority. You cut costs. And what was the result at the Chernobyl power plant? A staff that was undertrained, a staff that, while some of them saw the dark path they were on, couldn't speak freely about it, and a design flaw. A recipe that's final plating resulted in catastrophe. I have a little bit of experience in the medical field, and this incident at Chernobyl reminded me of this thing called the Swiss cheese accident causation model. If you Google, if you Google that, it will come up with some explanations. But I've got a picture of it on the screen here. But in a nutshell, this is what it is. Say you are part of a medical team that has a patient in your care. On one side, we have the patient, and on the other side, we have the dangers that could harm the patient. The only thing standing between your patient and the harm is Swiss cheese. Sounds like a poor way to protect them, right? But of course, the cheese is simply a metaphor for the protections put in place for your patient. But even so, you might think, well, if your protection, your cheese, has holes in it, how can you possibly expect your patient to be protected from dangers? One slice represents one form of protection. And since no single action is going to wholly protect a patient, we need to stack multiple layers of cheese. Uh, Maybe you double check the patient's name with another form of identification when you're administering medications. Maybe you require two staff people at the bedside if you're trying to get a patient up and out of bed. Perhaps every morning the entire care team meets together to make sure everyone is on the same page. And that's the elegance of this model. No one act is going to entirely protect a patient, but the hope is if you stack multiple layers of Swiss of that protection, none of the holes will line up and your patient will be protected. And this is the perfect model to use against what happened in Chernobyl. As the series shows us, there weren't many layers of cheese. We had a shift change, a request to pause the safety test because power was needed elsewhere, a supervisor who was hell-bent on completing the test to prove himself, a supervisor who was reckless, a supervisor who was toxic to his staff. This guy's a piece of work, as you can see. An instruction guide with lines crossed out, a young and inexperienced crew, a shift change during the test, a crew that had never performed the test before, and of course, faulty design. As you can see, pieces of cheese could have been placed here to protect the plant from disaster. Boom. That's what you get when you don't have cheese. Perhaps, so let's talk about what the pieces of cheese could have been. Perhaps you have a training program where staff are partnered with an experienced crew member for a period of time to build confidence, a stricter hiring process to weed out candidates that would be poor leaders, stricter guidelines for when the test can take place and who must be on staff for the test, a regularly updated instruction manual for the test, protocol for how to handle a test that isn't going well, and maybe control rods without graphite tips. Just a thought. And you get the point. The protections, or cheese, if you will, could have been put in place to prevent the disaster, and seemingly they were cheeseless. And I think their cheese was denied because of their way of life, the system that was built around them that put far too much emphasis on pride and retribution than on sensibility and openness. Another point I wanted to make about Chernobyl is anytime I watch a show that has a historical background, I know they've done a swell job when I want to learn even more. And Chernobyl did just that. Hell, I'm probably on the FBI watch list now for Googling so many topics about nuclear energy and how it works and all of that. I want to read books about Chernobyl, and at this point I'm so fascinated by what happened that I probably will. Chernobyl succeeded in coaxing out my curiosity, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I absolutely love it when art gives way to discovery, and for me, that was discovering that I'm interested in learning more about the history of this event and how its impact has carried to the present day. So I'm definitely going to be to keep this going and continue to learn more about it. Art and education paired, it's a beautiful thing. So that's Chernobyl. As you probably can tell from my synopsis and discussion here, I really had a great time with the series. I don't have a grading system for TV shows or films at this point, so I guess I would say thumbs up. Go watch it. It's good. I want to leave you with one final point. It's a quote from Valeri at the end of the series, and it goes like this. As he's riding off into the KGB car, he says, "To be a scientist is to be naive. We are so focused on our search for the truth that we fail to consider how few actually want us to find it. But it is always there, whether we see it or not, whether we choose to or not. The truth doesn't care about our needs or wants. It doesn't care about our governments, our ideologies, our religions. It will lie in wait for all time. And this, at last, is the gift of Chernobyl. Where I once would fear the cost of truth, now I only ask, what is the cost of lies?" Stay cynical.